Can you hear me?
I can, yes. Hi.
Hey, Ben. Hi. Well, it's 7 o'clock Central Time, and I'll go ahead and get this author chat started.
Excellent.
Okay, well, this evening I am so excited to be chatting with Liz Michalski for her second book, Darling Girl, which was published in May and was selected to be included in the Book of the Month subscription box. And a few quick thank yous before we begin. First off, thank you, Liz, so much for coming and chatting with the Peloton Moms Book Club tonight. We really appreciate your time. And thank you.
Me.
Yeah. Thank you to Jennifer Crowley, the group's founder, for everything that she does behind the scenes and to make these author chats possible for the group. And thank you to all of the moms who've already read Darling Girl and have expressed their love for it in the group, and to their friends even outside of the group. And thank you to the moms who aren't able to join us live, but are going to catch this chat on our YouTube channel later. We really appreciate you stopping by. And without further ado, let me give a quick intro for Liz. She is a former reporter and editor. She lives with her family in Massachusetts. She loves reading fairy tales and sometimes writing them. So thanks so much for joining us again.
Thank you very much for having me. And I'm so glad that you like Darling Girl.
I did, yeah. So for our members who haven't read Darling Girl yet, why don't you just give us a synopsis in your own words, what Darling Girl is about?
So Darling Girl is a very dark adult reimagined version of the Peter Pan tale, if Peter Pan actually grew up and lived in London. And for me, the story started when I had this crazy dream about this girl in Wendy Blue who was in the bottom of a stone turret, and she was hooked up to all these medical machines. And these boys in Peter Pan Green were flying in and out of the turret through the windows because there was no door. And they were saying things like, who will save us now? Who will sacrifice for us now that she's dying? And I woke up and I thought that was incredibly creepy and dark. And I reread Peter Pan and reread a ton about J.M. Barrie, and then started to write Darling Girl. And I finished it and I gave a draft of it to a friend of mine and I said, could you, take a look at this and tell me what you think? And she handed it to, she took it from me and she said, what's it about? And I said, it's about Peter Pan. And she said, okay. And she read it and gave it back. And I said, what did you think? And she said, it's not about Peter Pan. And I said, of course it's about Peter Pan, because at that point, I think it was called, Peter Pan, the boy who wouldn't grow up. And she gave it back again and she said, it is not about Peter Pan. Go home and figure it out. And I was just so mad. And I was saying bad words about her under my breath and took it home and stuck it under my desk and then reread it a couple of weeks after. And I thought to myself, damn it, she's so right. It's not about Peter Pan. It's about Peter Pan, but it's also about my oldest growing up and going off to college, and that feeling as a mom when you desperately want to protect your child from everything and keep them safe, and you know that you can't, and you know that no matter what you do, they have to grow up. So that to me is what Darling Girl is about.
Yeah, that makes sense. I could see that. So, in your description, you had called it a reimagining versus a retelling. And so what do you think the difference would be between a retelling of a story and a reimagining of a story?
I think for me, a retelling sticks fairly truly to the original storyline and just kind of puts a little bit of a different spin on it. I feel like mine doesn't quite do that. It takes the foundation of the story, but it kind of blows it up and sets it in a different time with different characters, but still within kind of that familiar framework that you know and love.
Mm-hmm. And there were some familiar characters in Darling Girl, one of whom I was particularly happy to see, and we're going to delve into some of that a little later on in the chat. But so out of all of the fairy tales, that have ever been written, what drew you to wanting to write a reimagining of Peter Pan in particular? Was there something about Barrie's writing or just something completely random or different in the choosing of that?
Well, I think, having that crazy dream about it really set me down the path. But I unfortunately or fortunately have a lot of crazy dreams. And I think rereading Pan as an adult was very different from reading it as a child, because as a child, at least when I read it, it's a story about being free and being a kid and never having to do things that adults don't want, that adults want you to do. But reading it as an adult, it really came across as almost a tragedy. It's a very sad story. It's a beautiful story and it's a magical story, but it's really a very sad story. It opens with the line, all children but one, must grow up. And Peter Pan is a very dark and lonely character in the original. And also, as I was researching it, J.M. Barrie had a really horrific life. I mean, he had a very, very dark life, even for a child of Victorian England, which was, not a great time period to grow up in. And I think that the details of his life really kind of drew me to try and find them in the story that he had written. And I was just fascinated by him.
Mm-hmm. I think I appreciate one of the things that you said in your answer. You can read that's one of the things that I love about books. You can read a story at one part in your life, and then you could come back to it later in your life and have a totally different interpretation, or it strikes a different nerve when you reread it. And I guess that's something that fairy tales can do when you get older, and you can see the darkness and then when you couldn't see that when you were younger. So
Absolutely.
do you have a favorite version of Peter Pan? Since I feel like you're probably an expert on Peter Pan at this point.
My favorite, I have two actually, and they're both children's versions. I love Peter and the Starcatchers, particularly the audio version. And there is a young adult retelling called Tiger Lily, which is gorgeous. It's by Jody Lynn Anderson, I believe, and it's absolutely fabulous.
I've heard of Tiger Lily. I haven't read it, but I'll have to check that out.
It's really, really good.
I love that you chose to tell this story from the perspective of the Darling women, the way that they interact with one another across generations, the way that they perceive their own family's history amongst the known lore of Peter Pan. And I would just love for you to tell us why you chose to tell the story from their perspective and what it means to you.
Oh, I think that's a really good question. It's very kind of germane to our time. There were a couple of things that struck me. First of all, to go back to J.M. Barrie, so for me, the Peter Pan really starts with J.M. Barrie, and J.M. Barrie's story really starts with his mother. His mother, Margaret, was Scottish. She was 8 when her mother passed away, and at 8 she kind of became the head of a household. She was the official caretaker at 8. She did the cooking, the cleaning, took care of her brothers and sisters, and she did that until she married. And when she married, she had 10 children, 2 of whom died before J.M. Barrie was born. J.M. Barrie was, I believe, like number 9 of her children. And you would think that being number 9 in this time when, babies really didn't have a great mortality rate, I think it was 1 in 5 children didn't grow up to see their 5th birthday in the 1860s, which is when J.M. Barrie was born, that he would be her favorite, but he wasn't. She had an older son named David after her husband, and he was the golden child. He was smart, he was funny, he was athletic, he was kind of everything that you would want, and he was the hope of their family. And when he was 14, he was ice skating, and he tripped over something. One version implies that what he tripped over was J.M. Barrie, who was 6 at the time. He hit his head, he died, and he never woke up. He never grew up. And this destroyed their family, particularly Margaret. She took to her bed. She really didn't come out of the room. And it was such a dire situation that J.M. Barrie at 6 dressed up in his dead brother's clothes, went into his mother's room, stood with his hands in his pockets like his brother David used to do, and whistled the way his brother David used to do to his mother. And his mother woke up and said, "Is that you?" And J.M. Barrie said, "No, Mom, it's just me." And I was fascinated by how that story shaped the rest of J.M. Barrie and what a powerful impact his mother had on his life. And I thought about from there the mothers that he put in Peter Pan. There's, Mrs. Darling, There's Wendy, who is really essentially a mother figure. She really doesn't do much besides, cook and clean and tell the boys what to do. And even Tinkerbell, who, has a little bit more of an adventurous life, but is willing to lay it all down for Peter and to die for him. And I thought, J.M. Barrie really didn't, despite his history with women, he really didn't do much with the women or the female figures in Peter Pan. And at the end of the book, the original Peter Pan, it ends with him saying that Peter Pan comes back for Wendy periodically, but then she gets too old. So he comes back for Jane, and Jane goes with him. And then Jane gets too old, and her daughter, who in the story is Margaret, goes with Peter Pan. And I thought, what is it like to be the mother or be the woman watching your daughter fly off to this place that you either loved or feared, depending on kind of how you read the story, and not being able to stop it? And what does that say about you, that you're the person at the window who's not having the adventures anymore? You're just watching others have them. So I was fascinated by that. And also when I was writing, the Me Too movement was really gaining steam. And I thought that the story has really always been told from the lens of Peter Pan and what a wonderful adventure it is. And I thought, it would be really interesting to set up a he said, she said version, and who would we really believe? So that's a very long answer to a very good question.
Well, I love that answer. And you're so right about the Me Too movement and the dichotomy between his version and Holly's experience. And I always love reading books that how people can experience the same thing, but have two different interpretations of what the events happened and what it meant to him versus what it meant to her. And yeah, you got a little dark there with that portion of Darling Girl. So,
but
it was well done.
It's a natural extension of Peter Pan. Like if you read the original, he's not a really warm and fuzzy character. He's charming at times. But the original talks about how the Lost Boys all have their own trees. And when they don't fit into the trees, Peter doesn't change the tree to fit the Lost Boys. He somehow changes the Lost Boys to fit the trees. And he talks about thinning out the herd of the Lost Boys when there gets to be too many of them. He lets John and Michael fall through the air and completely forgets about them and doesn't really care about rescuing them, except that he wants to impress Wendy. So he's not doing it out of the goodness of his heart. He's doing it to kind of make himself look good to her.
Yeah, you've given me a lot to think about when it comes to my recollection of who Peter Pan is, which I mean is a testament to a good reimagining, in my opinion. So well done.
Thank you.
So we're always curious about a author's writing process. Tell us a little bit about how you write the book. Do you plot it out in advance? Do you write it in a linear fashion? Do you always know where you're going to end up? Things like that.
So I tend to really spend a lot of time thinking about a story before I write it. I may spend, a couple of months not just researching it, but also kind of, I guess, telling myself the story. And it gets to the point where I almost, it sounds dopey, but I almost see it a little bit like a movie or a video, especially like the first chapter, and then usually one or two other points along the way, and hopefully a bit of the end. The end is usually there, but kind of vague for me. And I oftentimes will try and tell myself the story before I go to sleep, so it's the last thing I'm thinking about at night. And then when I am writing, it'll be the last thing I read at night and kind of the first thing I think about when I wake up. So there's almost like a subconscious angle to it. And I think that in some ways makes my story, for me at least, a little bit richer, because a lot of times there will be pieces that I don't necessarily see until the end. Like it's like writing, it's like being on the ground in your neighborhood and you know that your house is yellow. But when you fly overhead, you see that, every third house in the neighborhood is yellow, and you can see the lake, and before you just kind of saw, the puddle. And I think that is just kind of naturally how I do it. When I start writing, I also don't always write probably as much as I should at a time. I'll write like a big section of a chapter, and then maybe think about it for a few days. But I always try and leave myself, what I call like breadcrumbs to get back into the story. So if I'm writing well, I'll stop maybe halfway through and leave some half-formed sentences on the page so that when I come back, I'm not sitting there for 20 minutes trying to get back into it. I have a starting point and can go from there.
Mm-hmm. I love how you said you tell yourself the story first and then, translate it to the page. That's really interesting. And I can see where that would make it just, hopefully it would flow out better or just make a more cohesive story when you can tell it to yourself first before you tell it to others. So that makes sense. And that's the first time I've heard that from an author. So that's interesting. One thing we're always curious about is, we as the readers, we get to see this final published version, and we're often curious as to how close that kind of mirrors to the first draft, and what the process of editing and the changes and the revisions that you went through to get from your first draft to the final draft. Was there anything that you thought it was going to go one way and then we ended up making a different decision through the editing process? Or
Yeah, I think so. I mean, Holly, I know, some of the feedback I've gotten on Holly is that she's not super likable. And for me, she's a lot more likable than she was in the beginning of the story. And I think, it's not that she's not likable. It's just that she keeps making bad choices. But I really wanted to show a mom who had been through a lot, and because of what she's been through, is just desperate to protect her family. I mean, if you read the book, there's the first flashback shows Holly as being much more lighthearted. When we read about her in the beginning, she's very like hands-on and tamped down, and she has a list of things that Jack can and cannot do. And she's frantic when he cuts himself, and she's just very kind of in control. But the flashback, I hope, shows that when she was younger, she was like, oh yes, I will just totally get in the car with this random stranger that I don't know his last name or where he lives, and it'll be great. It'll be so much fun. And yes, I will drive in my husband's really fancy, fun, tiny sports car while pregnant with twins, because what could possibly go wrong? And she kind of, learns the hard way, or I wouldn't say that she learns, but because of what she experiences the hard way, her personality really changes. So I think I tried to soften her a little bit with some of the flashbacks. I wound up really wanting to keep, is it okay to give spoilers? I mean, do we assume that? Okay. I really wanted to keep Captain Cook's hook in the story. And that was, my editor was really gracious about it. She basically said, this doesn't work for me. The easiest thing to do would be just to cut it out. And I was like, but I really love it. And she was like, well, then the hard thing to do is to write a lot more scenes, with it in there and make it kind of more grounded. So I, of course, did the hard way. And I also wound up rewriting the ending a couple of times. I knew that I wanted, for me, because the book is told from the perspective of the women, or from Holly, but it's really a woman's story. I wanted Captain Cook in there, and I wanted him to be kind of the swashbuckling hero type, but I also wanted to make sure that the women were the agents of change, that the women were the ones who saved themselves and saved each other. But getting to that ending took a couple of different revisions.
Mm-hmm. I liked the flashbacks that you included of Holly, because, as mothers, we weren't always just mothers. There's more to us. And I think that added context to who she is, and it was able to make her a more rounded character. When I read her, I liked that. So I appreciated that those were included in the book. So I want to pick your brain a bit about some of the decisions that you made in telling the story, and including some of the modern day relevant themes. We kind of touched on the Me Too movement. For starters, why did you choose to have Peter Pan as an adult in this book?
Because I was fascinated by, one of the things I love about the original story, which I do absolutely love, and if you haven't read it, I feel like everybody should. I think it's like 242 pages, so it's not super long, but it's beautifully written, and he leaves all the space for you to imagine the characters. I always think of this story as like a charcoal sketch as opposed to a full oil painting, because the bones are there, but what you bring to the story at different points in your life really allow you to kind of flesh it out and keep it something that's very evergreen and pertinent. But in it, the idea that he can't grow up, I was really fascinated by that because it doesn't necessarily say he can't get older. And just, we've all known people, and in our culture, we tend to say it's men who do get older, but don't necessarily grow up and have that same, I think of it like a toddler, if you've been around toddlers, they are all emotion and need and want, and they want what they want, and they don't care what they have to do to get it. There's one of my favorite authors, Neil Gaiman, says in one of his books that every child thinks he is a god. And it's true, like 2-year-olds really do think that they rule the world. And it's such a good thing that they don't, because a lot of times they don't have any morals at that point. And I thought, wouldn't it be really interesting if he did get physically older, but he retained all the things that we find charming as Peter Pan in a boy? Would they really be so charming when he's an adult? Would his inability to really have empathy be as charming as it is when he's a child? So that's kind of what I was really interested in.
Mm-hmm. And that makes sense, when you said that, talked about him not being able to grow up, but it didn't talk about him not getting older. And I mean, I feel like you nailed it when you said, we all know those people, whether it be a man or a woman, who just, they don't really grow up maturity wise, but they're getting older. So that makes sense. Okay. So Peter Pan never wanted to grow up. And in the book, you have Holly Darling as the boss of the skincare company, which markets and capitalizes on youthful beauty. I thought it was so clever. How did you come to just make that sort of correlation between, him not wanting to grow up and then having Holly be the CEO boss of this skincare company, and, kind of said the same, I guess, two sides of the same coin kind of thing?
Well, I was thinking about, when I started off thinking about it, what I was really thinking about was the Darling women, and how in every generation, one of them goes off to quote unquote, kind of play house with him, to do the cooking and the cleaning and the sweeping, and how, in society, a lot of times women wind up shouldering that, but at the same time, they're supposed to always look young while doing it. Like always, like you can have, 4 kids and still be expected to, just look like a model. And what an unfair set of expectations that can be. And I thought it would be fun to kind of play with that, the darlings have a little bit of Peter Pan in them too. They always look good. They always look very, very youthful. But that they are kind of feeding into the stereotypes that we as women face. And I loved researching that part of it, because so much of what I put in the book is really true. I've never seen a Kim Kardashian show, but when I was looking up breakthroughs in skincare, I stumbled across the vampire facials, which is when you take your own blood and you have it on your face, and it's supposed to help make your skin look younger and plumper. And then there's a dermatologist who will, for a very expensive fee, make skincare products from your own blood that are also supposed to help your skin. And then with the other part of the science, which was the blood infusions, there's been all this study. They actually took 2 mice, an old mice and a young mouse, and they stitched them together. And the older mice really benefited from the younger mice's circulatory system. Their response times were faster, their memories were better, their organs were healthier. The young mice did not fare quite as well. But then from there, a company in California for a period of time was taking platelets from young people, or paying young people for platelets, and then turning around and selling them to older clients. So the FDA shut them down, but then they started up again. So I find the line between magic and science fascinating.
Yeah, it certainly is. Kind of segueing here because we were talking about youthful beauty. When I was reading this, Holly for me was a Charlize Theron. If like my dream casting for Holly would be Charlize Theron because she is just flawless. And when it came to Captain Cook, I thought about the actor from Once Upon a Time, the TV show, but I didn't have a clear picture of Peter Pan. Did you have any dream casting if it ever came to that?
I love Charlize Theron. I think she's gorgeous, and I've loved everything she's been in, especially the kind of magical ones like The Old Guard and Hancock. I think she's fabulous in both of those. Peter Pan for me is always Andrew Scott, who played Moriarty in Sherlock. I think he just walks that perfect line between polite and crazy.
Yes, he does. And in Fleabag, I remember him from Fleabag also. Yeah, that's a good one. Okay. I support that. Let's see. So this may be a tough one for you, but who is your favorite character in Darling Girl and why? Or if that's too hard, who is your favorite character in the original Peter Pan and why?
I think my favorite character in Darling Girl is probably Jane, because I feel like she's just seen and done so much, and she's so persnickety, and yet she really loves her daughter and will do anything for her. I always picture her like Dame Maggie Smith, Downton Abbey. I also really had a lot of fun writing Tinkerbell. Because she doesn't talk and she's so physical. I just love that. And in the original, I think Tinkerbell is probably my favorite because she's just so sassy.
Definitely Tinkerbell in the original. I loved her. So I loved that you included a version reincarnation of Captain Hook into the story. That was when I alluded to it earlier. I was so happy to see him because he's one of my favorites for whatever reason. Call him a villain. I don't really think of him as a villain. Just tell us a little bit about your version of Hook and why you created him the way that you did.
I think, when I first read Peter Pan, Captain Hook is really the bad guy. And then when I read it as an adult, I thought he's really not that bad. He is just the one who wants to make sure that everybody does what they're supposed to do. He is the grown up in the room, which is boring and annoying to Peter and the Lost Boys. And I wanted somebody with that sense of gravity. And I thought that, having my Captain Cook have had his own struggles, and still be willing to wake up in the morning and work through them and try and help other people was kind of the epitome of being an adult. Even helping people he doesn't really know. Whereas Peter, because he's kind of perpetually stuck in that toddler stage, isn't so much about helping other people. He's really about taking from other people. So they were a good foil to each other.
Yeah, I can see that. I liked how he wasn't perfect. He was flawed, but he was there, and I would have loved more of him. So when your editor was like, I think you need to cut him, I was like, no. I was shaking my head when you said that. I'm so glad that was not a cut. Was there a particular reason that you chose not to include a trip to Neverland in the story?
Yes. So I have always loved stories where you don't always get to see behind the curtain. It's like when you go to Disney and there are all those tunnels. And so that is like the true Disney where all the magic takes place. I wanted readers to be able to bring their own sense of magic and their own imagining of what it looked like to the page. I mean, for me, Neverland in Darling Girl is a beautiful but very dangerous place. It's, has flowers the size of dinner plates, but they all have teeth. And the mermaids are stunning and beautiful until they try and pull you under. And, the Lost Boys are gorgeous, but they're also very feral. And I wanted readers to kind of be able to play with that in their head a little bit and see what it looks like, because it's going to be different for everybody.
Yeah, that makes sense. Did you have a favorite nod / Easter egg relating to the original Peter Pan? For instance, one of my favorites was the red feather that was left in Eden's room in the cottage the night she disappeared. I feel like you sprinkled them within the book. Did you have a particular favorite?
I think one of my favorites, even though it's gruesome, is Michael's fall. Because when I was writing it, I just kept thinking about the original, and I think a lot of people who have just seen the Disney movie is beautiful. I love all the movies about Peter Pan, but I really felt like that was a true extension of what J.M. Barrie wrote in the book, and I also stuck an Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. reference in there too, just for fun, because I love that show.
I love that show too. Mine was Nana, said Jody. Yeah, that was. Well, I've got a few more questions. And so if anybody tuning into the live tonight has any, please feel free to put them in the chat box and I will do my best to get them asked and answered for you. A ton of our members they also enjoy the Book of the Month Club. Tell us, what was your experience like being chosen for that popular service?
It was crazy. It was something I never imagined or expected. And it was such an amazing surprise. And I think I found it in March and I couldn't tell anyone. And then and even then I was like, well, that's, it was exciting and I was really happy. But I had no idea how active the Book of the Month Club is on social media. And to wake up and have people I don't know tagging me in stories about my book, it was crazy. But the best part was when my daughter is at college and she sent me a screenshot of her phone with a text from one of her friends that was all in caps, and it said, "Emma, your mother is in the Book of the Month Club." So that was like, bought me a tiny bit of college person cred. So I was very happy about that.
Yeah. It is always nice when you can impress your older children. So we have a ton of aspiring writers in our group also. Do you have any advice or tips for our members who are hoping to write a book one day?
Yeah. The first is just to write. The first is just to read, because you really have to read, or at least for me, I really have to read for a couple of reasons. One, to figure out how to do things. Two, to feed my brain. And three, because I think that by doing that, you really train your ear and your eye to what good writing is. Also, Writer Unboxed is a blog that I belong to. It's an online community and it's phenomenal. They post a different post every day on some aspect of writing, from plot to marketing to developing characters and setting. I think it's writerunboxed.com, and it's absolutely wonderful. Another thing is to develop community if you can. It's a long road to writing a book, and it really helps if you have people around you who love to write and who love to read as well. And that can be hard to do, but it's really lovely to have somebody to share the experience with. And I guess the last one is, just to write. I don't write every day now necessarily, but when I was starting out as a reporter and as an editor, it was really good training to have to sit down every single day and write something every single day, and then rewrite it, because I think it's like any kind of muscle. The more you use it, hopefully the better off it becomes.
This next question is always a little awkward to ask, because we just read and loved Darling Girl, but now we're like, okay, so what's next, Liz? Are you working on anything, or early stages, anything that you can share?
I'm working on another kind of reimagining of a classic fairy tale. I'm about 40 pages into it, so it's still really early days, and I feel like Elmer Fudd. I'm just trying to sneak up very, very quietly and hunt the rabbit. But I'm hoping that my agents will like it, so that's kind of where I am.
Okay, fantastic. Well, my last question is, we always like to end our chats asking what our author is currently reading and loving, because we're always looking for a good recommendation within the group. So do you have any to share?
Yes, I just finished reading Minnie Driver's autobiography, Managing Expectations. And I liked it so much that I bought the Audible version because she reads it in her own voice, and it's just funny and smart, and makes me laugh, and makes me really sad in some places too. So it's a really good read. I also just finished The Change by Kirsten Miller, which was just super empowering and really fun. And my next book is, I always bungle this title, When Women Were Dragons, I think, which was really good. And for just like a really fun read, I also just finished on audio. I read the book, and then also I do that. I wind up doing that a lot. I read the book and I'm like, oh, this is so good. I just want to listen to it again. Rosalind Palmer Takes the Cake by Alexis Hall, which is kind of a fun romance set to the scene of the Great British Baking Show.
I have that one on my TBR, and I read The Change, loved The Change, and I have When Women Were Dragons on my TBR, also waiting in my library hold for that one. But I'll have to check out Mini Drivers also, because I love a good memoir that's narrated by the person who wrote the book. So fantastic. Well, thank you so much for sharing those with us. And I didn't see any audience members chime in with questions. So I'm going to take that as that I did a good job moderating and asked all of their questions for them. Well, thank you so much, Liz, for joining us tonight at the PMBC. We loved Darling Girl. We will continue to champion it in the book club. And we appreciate your time this evening and wish you much continued success with the book.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, and thank you for asking such great questions. I really appreciate it.
All right. Have a great evening.
You as well. Bye-bye.
Bye.